So what are PBMs and why do people think that they're evil? So PBMs are pharmacy benefit managers, and they act as a middleman between usually insurance companies as well as the end consumer or employers when it comes to managing healthcare expenses, especially as it relates to medications and prescriptions, essentially. So healthcare is, as we all know, incredibly complex, and it's a large network of contracts and agreements, and a lot of things are unknown. Ultimately, it results in something that we see as very expensive and something that a lot of people don't know about how it works, aside from the fact that it's pricey and can be very frustrating to navigate. Now, PBMs don't make that any better. So what happens in healthcare is that there are manufacturers that produce prescriptions. There are generics, which means that these are usually older drugs. They no longer have an active patent, and anybody can make them as long as they're able to do so. And there might be a couple of manufacturers that make them and they can compete on price. And that's why generics are typically lower priced than brand name medications. Brand name medications are usually newer drugs. They are under patent, and why patents are important is because the cost of the drug really costs next to nothing to make. But what happens is that the cost of development usually takes about more than $1 billion to create a medication, and it's because there's a lot of trial and error, a lot of cost goes into the clinical trials, and then there are a lot of failures. So you really have to pay for making those bets. So what happens is that once there is a successful drug or therapy, the company that has invested all those research and development dollars needs to recoup their investment and then be able to invest in the next drug and all the trial and errors that come with that. So that's why brand name medications are protected under patents, and even though the drug might be a couple cents to make, they can charge hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars for medications because they need to recoup that cost. So what happens is that there are a bunch of manufacturers that make these drugs, whether it's generic or brand name drugs, and then you have the ultimate end user, which is all of us, that need the drugs. Well, not all of us, but depending on your prescriptions, what medications you take, and what conditions you have. And in the middle, there's all these different players. For example, some people may receive healthcare from the insurance companies directly. They might buy an individual plan, let's say off the exchange, or they might be on Medicare, or they might be on Medicaid, and so forth. And then also most other folks will get their health insurance from their company, their employer. And their company might pay for health insurance, and their company is in the business of really choosing healthcare for employees. And a lot of times the companies need to shop around. And what happens is that it's really cumbersome for a company, let's say, or an individual to go to each of these manufacturers and say, hey, look, I'll pay you this much for this medication. It just won't work logistically. So what happens is that there are all these middlemen called PBMs, and they aggregate all these contracts with the manufacturers, and they license those contracts to insurance companies who then pass on those costs onto the end user, whether it's the companies and their employees or a subscriber individually. So that's the purpose of the PBM, which is to make that process a one point of contact versus having to go to all the different drug companies and negotiate all these different prices. Now, although that sounds great from a logistics perspective, right? It's like we go to Walmart and we shop because we don't want to go to each manufacturer and try to pick out what we need because we might not need everything all at once. However, the issue comes in with the incentives that are in the middle. So the drug costs are a black box. People really don't know how much a drug costs, and because the cost of making the drug is so small, the cost of the drug is really dependent on how much the manufacturers and all the middlemen want to make. Because it's not like a lot of the other services, like let's say flat screen TVs, where now flat screen TVs are very inexpensive because people know what's the raw material cost and what's my distribution cost and what are the margins I need to make. But for pharmaceuticals, they need to really predict how much is it going to cost me to make the next blockbuster drug? How much is it going to cost for me to develop the next billion-dollar drug? That's like saying, how many lottery tickets do I have to buy in order for me to win the lottery again? You just don't know. And that's why this adds to the complexity of pricing medications. And when you price medications, what happens is that there's, again, a lot of different incentives involved in the middle. So what happens now is that all the prices for the medications, that's all trade secret, meaning that you can't tell people what the prices are. And healthcare is one of the only industries where you can say, well, here's what you need, and if you don't take it, you might die, but we can't really tell you how much it costs until the very end when you pay the bill. Unheard of in other industries. That needs to change. So there are a few players out there like Cost Plus Drugs and so forth that are looking to make this more transparent, where they're saying, hey, look, whatever the cost of the drug is, we're just going to add a 20% or whatever the margin is, and we're going to pass that cost on to you. That's it. But that's really only for generics. A lot of times for brand name medications, there's nothing like that so far. And what happens there in the middle is that there are a lot of sales incentives and kickbacks associated with it. And that's why a lot of people don't trust this process from the outside, because there's a lot of money that can be made. Where we started Doctor's Choice was in Rhode Island. And I believe in 2019, don't quote me on the actual dates and so forth. In 2019, Judge Judy bought the most expensive house in Rhode Island. Rhode Island's sort of this dichotomy economy where you have people on the coast, on the beaches, very wealthy, $1 million homes, everybody else, not so much. And I think she bought a house for something like $12 million. Well, the year before, a year after, the most expensive house, it was still in the tens of millions of dollars. Although with inflation, I'll be living in $10 million houses soon. But as of recent, the person who bought those houses, really unknown person, but what did they do? They started and sold a PBM. And it's because there's a lot of money to be made in the business. So what happens is a manufacturer, let's say, makes a brand name medication. They will go to a PBM and say, all right, we have a couple competitors and we want you to really push our medications. So what we can do is that if you sell X number of prescriptions, then we will give you a bonus. And that's how these companies incentivizes the middleman to then push one drug versus another to be more competitive. And what happens is that the middleman says, okay, we're going to go to the people that distribute the medications, whether it's the insurance broker that talks to the employer or anybody else, and say, hey, look, we'll pass on some of those kickbacks to you if you design the plan where people have to use this particular drug. And that times the number of drugs out there leads to a lot of disincentives to actually say, what do people need? And let's give it to them at the lowest cost possible. So what happens there is that, let's say, making some of these numbers up, $1,000 medication, brand name medication, it might cost $10 to make. So $990 of that is margin. A lot of TV ads, a lot of YouTube ads, ask your doctor about this drug. Then what happens is that they may say, hey, look, it's $1,000. That's what the end user is going to pay, or the insurance is going to pay. And for the PBM, we'll wholesale it to you for $300. So me as a manufacturer, I make $300. You as the PBM, there's sort of a $700 margin. You do whatever you want with it. And let's say we'll, and then if you sell X dollars more of this drug, then we'll give you another $50 from that pocket. So that's why PBMs can then mark up the drugs in a significant way, pass that cost on to the employer, and then talk to the insurance agents or the benefits consultants and say, hey, look, if you include this drug in the formulary, which is the list of drugs that are covered, and if they have to go to a certain pharmacy to get it at this cost, then we'll share some of that margin with you. And you don't have to count it. It's up to you if you want to disclose it. So that's where a lot of times the misincentives come in, because it's like, oh, why are we only covering these drugs? Well, studies show that this, that, and the other thing, but the studies really show, that the study is really the bank account, and that's why a lot of people don't trust the system, and employers don't know who's getting kickbacks. Although employers are becoming more and more prudent in asking for those disclosures, at the end of the day, even the insurance companies are getting these payments from PBMs to include or exclude certain medications in their formulary. And that's why each year, especially during the open enrollment period, it's like a shuffle, because this year this medication's covered, next year this medication's covered. And if you're the consumer and you only have a limited number of options, let's say you have a plan that has only these doctors your doctors in the network, but now one of your medications is not covered because you use another medication that's similar because of these PBM rules, then you have to go back to your doctor. It's an additional cost and say, hey, look, I can't take this drug anymore because it's not covered. And then also in extreme cases, insurance may force you to use one particular pharmacy over another because they have these special contracts given, all these different incentives. They might say you have to use our specialty contract. And that's why a lot of the insurance companies have bought PBMs themselves. United Health is Optum, that's your PBM. There's Caremark and Aetna and CVS, SilverScript, and so forth. A lot of these PBMs are owned by the insurance companies because they see how profitable they are. And because of that, again, a lot of misaligned incentives, which ultimately leads to higher costs. And a lot of times for certain insurance companies, the difference between making their numbers and not making their numbers is whether they get those reimbursements from their PBMs. So that amount of revenue in the healthcare industry is a tremendous kickback. And that's why people don't trust the system, is because you have all these different trade secrets called pricing, again, unheard of in other industries. And that leads to people feeling like they're getting ripped off. And that's why a lot of spotlights are being shown on these PBMs, and people are demanding more transparency.